Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first session of this European Studies Conference here at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Jacqueline Bhabha, and I'm a professor here at both at the Kennedy School and the School of Public Health, and I'm delighted to be chairing this important panel on segregation of Roma children. This is an issue which many of us, and particularly many of our panelists, have been working on for years, for decades. And so it's actually quite tragic that we still have this as a central human rights concern in Europe today. It's surprising that something as fundamental as the right to education, which is enshrined in the European Convention of Human Rights and is kind of embodied in the European Union's notion of civility, progress, union, should still be a battlefield for some of the most discriminated and stigmatized populations in Europe. So I think it's really important for us to discuss this as we think about Europe and the big picture of Europe with the many challenges there are now. We are thinking, of course, about issues to do with security and peace and issues of migration, to think about how populations that are long-standing European populations themselves are still struggling to realize some of the most fundamental rights on which the Union was built. So I'm very glad we're having this panel. I'm glad that you're here with us, and I'm delighted that we have our panelists. As you can see, instead of 5, we're only 3, and that's, of course, the consequence of the weather, but I don't think that's going to affect the quality or the breadth or depth of our conversations. So what we're going to do is each of our panelists will speak for not more than 15 minutes. I'll ask some questions, and we'll have an inter-panel discussion for maybe another 15 minutes, and then we'll open the discussion to the floor. So please, as you hear the panelists, please start formulating your contributions and your questions. So both our panelists are experienced scholars, policymakers and advocates. Both of them, I think, embody what I think of as the best of scholarship, which is this close bridge between the academy and policy making and activism. So the knowledge that they have, the studies that they do, are really put to the service of policy reform and political mobilization, and that I think is very much at the core of many of the issues that we're going to be talking about. So for many of you as students, I think these two colleagues actually also represent a wonderful model of how deep knowledge and career success does not prevent one from still engaging at grassroots level in struggles that are ongoing. And I think it's an important lesson for many of us today. So our first speaker is Dr. Iulius Rostas, who is a professor, an assistant professor at the Central European University in Budapest, and I'm sure many of you are aware of the ongoing struggles in that institution, though I gather just as of yesterday that you've been reaccredited, so I'm glad to hear that. But Dr. Rostas is also the chair of Romani Studies at the CEU, and he's worked for many years on issues of Roma history, Roma rights, Roma discrimination. For anybody actually who studies rights, researchers in this field, he's a very familiar name. You can't really have a bibliography about the Roma without having reference to his work. He is a senior fellow with the Open Society Foundation's Roma Initiatives Office, and again, as many of you probably know, OSF has been a leading advocate and a leading supporter of work on Roma rights in Europe, so a very important support for which it has actually attracted much criticism, particularly in Hungary. So that's also an important factor in this struggle, I think. Dr. Rostas has worked for the European Roma Rights Center and the government of Romania, and he's consulted with the OSCE, about which we'll hear more in a little minute. He's the editor of 10 Years After, a history of Roma school desegregation in Central and Eastern Europe. And he's published extensively on issues of Roma participation, Roma identity, Roma school desegregation, the Roma rights movement in civil society, and a range of social and political issues relevant to Roma political participation and advancement. So with that short introduction, Dr. Rostas, thank you so much for braving the storms and joining us, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to share with you my thoughts and to have a debate, hopefully, on Roma school segregation. I consider Roma school segregation a very important topic as we struggle to achieve equality for Roma in Europe. So, to me, school segregation is deeply linked with racism against Roma, or something we call anti-Gypsyism. Why I am saying that is because to me, school segregation, the fact that Roma children are separated from their peers, is due mostly to their ethnicity. I will come back to this point a bit later. Let me tell you how segregation is happening. Basically, Roma children are separated within the educational systems in countries in Europe from their peers in separate schools, so the so-called gypsy schools, in separate classes, sometimes in the same school, but in separate classes. Also sometimes in the same schools, but in separate buildings, and separate facilities sometimes. And then there are other bureaucratic arrangements that lead to separation of Roma children from their peers. Like, for example, in Hungary, there was a program for gifted children, that were supposed to attend school only from time to time and go for the exams. Well, as you can imagine, a lot of Roma children ended up in this program for gifted children. Now, don't get me wrong, I have a very good opinion on Roma, but not all those kids were gifted. So that was one arrangement, bureaucratic arrangement, to keep Roma children separated from their peers. And then, of course, one of the most egregious forms of discrimination against Roma in education is the overrepresentation of Roma children in special schools, schools for mentally disabled. Well, I'll be happy to answer your questions if you have related to this, but I'll rather move on and make some points when it comes to segregation. So I want to make clear that Roma school segregation is not directly linked with poverty. Some scholars are trying to link segregation with social status and poverty. Well, let me tell you why I don't go for that. If you go and interview policymakers, school principals, teachers, you talk to Roma and non-Roma parents, and to children themselves as well, you will see that the reasons for separating Roma children from their peers are almost all linked to the fact that these children are Roma. And then, as you know, Roma are, and plenty of prejudices that follow. So, this separation is not necessarily linked on poverty. It's not due to the fact that these children are coming from poor families. You have also Roma children that are not necessarily coming from poor backgrounds, but still they are separated. Yeah. So it has basically to do with Roman identity. Let me tell you something that usually complicates the Roma school segregation in Europe to the school segregation of African Americans here in US. And that is the link between school segregation and Romani language. Now, in Europe, it is possible, if you are a minority group, to enjoy certain special rights, including the right to study in your mother tongue. So if you are a national minority in one of the countries and you are legally recognized, you have the right to have your own school in your own language. Well, that's not the case in segregated schools for Roma. There are only 2 schools in Europe that teach fully the curricula in Romani language. So we are not talking about that kind of situation that is done for the protection of minority. We are not even talking about bilingual education where a significant part of the curricula is taught in Romani language. No, no, no. We are talking about mainstream education following a mainstream curricula, but separate facilities for children. So definitely separation it's not done to protect Romani language, because kids in one class, for example, they can study different languages. Yeah? So in theory, the fact that you want to study also Romani language should not be a reason to segregate Roma children. Then one other point I want to make is related to language proficiency. Now, very often, Roma children are separated because they don't speak, allegedly, they don't speak very well the majority language, the language of the instruction in the school. Well, that might be the case. If you are raised at home in a different language, then you might have some problems when you go to school. But however, here issue gets a bit complicated. It's about the access to preschool education, if that one is free or not. And then it comes to something else, what the European Court of Human Rights looked at in a case, Orsus against Croatia. So in that case, the Croatian authorities invoked the low proficiency of Romani language in Croatian language. So for that reason, they created the so-called catch-up classes. Well, in front of the court, they were unable to prove that those are catch-up classes because these children were basically having all their education separated from their peers. And as you can imagine, separation means also, in the case of Roma, inferior quality education. The Croatian government was asked to prove that they have an integration plan, meaning, okay, you design some special measures for these children that do not speak well enough Croatian, and then you have a plan after 1 year or 2 years to integrate them, gradually into the mainstream education. There was no such plan. So basically that was just a reason to separate the children. Let's talk also about segregation and housing. In most of the cases, when we have the so-called gypsy schools, they are located closely to Roma neighborhoods, but also very close to the non-Roma neighborhoods. So usually, for example, in Slovakia, these schools are at the margin of Roma community in interaction with the non-Roma. But somehow it turns out that they are becoming Roma-only schools. There was a practice in the past 20 years for local authorities to build schools in Roma neighborhoods to keep Roma segregated. Well, maybe one more thing to add, that to me, Roma school segregation is not only a matter of philosophical discussion, like in Brown versus Board of Education, that segregation means imminent discrimination. Why is that? Because educational experts tend to be focused too much on the results of the tests, to measure how much information we acquire and some skills that we developed and so on. What usually educational experts forget about is that education is also about socialization. And that's key, because the role of education is not only to produce qualified, I'd say, robots for the labor market, but rather to produce good citizens for our societies. And a good citizen is the one that knows his or her rights, is able to defend these rights, is engaged in the good of and the common interests of the community in which he or she lives. So in that sense, schools plays an important role in the socialization, including political socialization of the students. Well, very often this aspect is disregarded. If you are separated and your only source of knowledge is your very closed community, that very often is also poor, marginalized, and having low level of education because of historical reasons, then definitely you receive inferior quality education. Not to add that Roma is one of the most hated groups in Europe. That is proven by different research, including the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency, PIU research in 2014, and also RAND, a think tank in London. So to me, school segregation reproduces inequalities in societies between Roma and non-Roma, and we should bring an end to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rostas, for that important presentation. I have several issues which I am looking forward to discussing, but I will hold them for after the next presentation. So I'm delighted to introduce to you Tatiana Peric, who has been involved in this field of human rights and the kind of engagement with issues of social justice, discrimination and segregation for decades. She has worked for many international organizations, including UNDP, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Council of Europe, and she is now working for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, where she is the Deputy Chief contact point for Roma and Sinti issues in the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, which is a sub-office within OSCE based in Warsaw. She has extensive knowledge and experience of working on rights issues, and like Dr. Rostas, she's also been involved with the European Roma Rights Center, so she's also straddled international organizations and civil society organizations. So, Tatjana, thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction, but thank you also for your kind invitation to speak at this panel. I'm really happy to see that the interest in the issues surrounding the education of Roma children goes beyond Europe as well, because I'm sure it also touches on some of the issues that have been discussed in this country as well, though not exactly in the contemporary context. Let me start by telling you about a very sad anniversary that we marked last year in November. We marked the 10th anniversary of the court decision DH versus the Czech Republic. What happened there? In 1999, a group of 18 Roma children and their parents from the area of the city of Ostrava in eastern Czech Republic, who were segregated in schools for children with mental and intellectual disabilities, decided to seek legal defense and decided to first address domestic courts. And after as much as 8 years, in 2007, their case was brought to a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, which established that there was indeed discrimination in segregating these Roma children to the so-called special schools. And the court ordered the Czech Republic to stop this practice and to make changes that this kind of treatment of children no longer takes place. Now, why is this a sad anniversary? Because 10 years later, in November 2017, we have still a very problematic situation when it comes to the segregation of Roma children in special schools, but also, as Dr. Rostas explained to you, in several other ways of how Roma children are being segregated. Well, there has been a lot of policy development in Europe in the past 15 years when it comes to Roma economic, social, and cultural rights. And one of the very few areas where there is some visible improvement is the area of education. We have data from UNICEF, from national statistical organizations as well, that prove that school enrollment rates among Roma children are growing. However, the problem is that the progress pretty much stops there, because there is still a problem of dropout, there is still a problem of lower quality education for Roma children, and there is definitely still a problem of segregation of Roma children in special schools. Despite DH versus the Czech Republic, Orsush versus Croatia that Dr. Rostas had mentioned, and a number of other court cases related to Roma children's education, including segregation, that came about in the meanwhile. In 2016, the European Commission, in a report itself, admitted that only in the European Union member states, and let me remind you, out of 28 member states, segregation in some form of Roma children exists in 15 states. So practically more than a half of the EU. But let me just emphasize, this is not just about the EU member states. There is a number of other countries that are not the EU member states where this problem is acute. Now, something that is different, that has changed, is that since 2014, in the EU, there have been 3 infringement procedures against member states, meaning that the Commission itself has concerns about the breach of its own anti-discrimination law, and the countries in particular are, in 2014, the Czech Republic, 2015, there was the start of the infringement procedure against Slovakia, and the most recent one, by the end of 2016, an infringement procedure against Hungary. And these changes, these countries, as a consequence of the infringement procedures, have introduced some changes, mostly of legislative nature. However, European Commission's own experts are still concerned and are saying that actually some of these legislative changes may be furthering segregation in education and not effectively combating it. Why is this all bad? Well, Dr. Rostas has mentioned a number of reasons, and one of them that I would like to re-emphasize is the issue of diversity. Our societies are increasingly diverse, and as long as we have still segregation of children in schools on ethnic ground, we have a serious problem with, social, how can I say, socialization was the term that Dr. Rostas used. Basically, children from various ethnic groups, in this case Roma and non-Roma children, are not being in contact. They are being educated separately. They live separately as well. Now, what that means also additionally for Roma children is that segregated schools, segregated classes, and these other ways of segregation also are, in a vast majority of cases, unfortunately connected with education of substandard quality too, which leads them afterwards to low-paid employment at best. And it also deprives the non-Roma children from enjoying multicultural environments, getting to know their Roma peers, working together with them, etc. Now, as you have heard, I work for the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Why does this matter to the OSCE? We are mostly known as an organization that works on security issues. But what is lesser known is that in the OSCE we have the so-called three baskets of security. The first one is political and military. This is what we are mostly known for. You probably know that OSCE is currently very involved in the situation in Ukraine, where we have a large monitoring mission. However, there is also the economic and environmental basket and the so-called human dimension basket, which is about human rights and democratic institutions, where we consider that discrimination and issues such as segregation are a threat to security, especially in multicultural and multi-ethnic societies. And OSCE was the first intergovernmental organization that in 1990 recognized the specific problem of discrimination of Roma, Sinti, and other related groups. And until a couple of years ago, when the Council of Europe established a specific post, we were the only intergovernmental organization that had an institution specifically to work on Roma human rights issues, and this is the contact point for Roma and Sinti issues, the office that I'm working for. And as an intergovernmental organization, we are particularly and mostly interested in what our participating states are doing to address these practices. And the commitments of the OSCE's participating states when it comes to Roma are outlined in the 2003 action plan on improving the situation of Roma and Sinti in the OSCE region. And what our action plan says about the issue of segregation in a nutshell is the following. The participating states need to stop the practice, to desegregate schools, and to provide more data on the phenomenon and monitor its development. And we keep emphasizing that the primary responsibility for doing this is on local and national governments, not intergovernmental organizations such as our task is to support the national governments in doing this. So we keep reminding them. And for instance, in 2012, we had one of our field assessment visits to the Czech Republic specifically on the issue of segregation in education as an illustration about what we do. Then 2 years later, we followed up with a seminar where we put together civil society and national authorities to discuss the progress made. And we keep raising this issue, not just in the Czech Republic, but in many other states where this is necessary. And for instance, last year in November, to mark the anniversary of DH versus the Czech Republic, we issued a public statement together with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, and others to remind the governments of our participating states that this discriminatory practice is still taking place. But we really need to address the issues of the context in which this is taking place. Because this is unfortunately just one piece of a big puzzle. We have to put it in the context of racism and discrimination against Roma that Dr. Iulius Rostas also already started talking about. And in addition to racism, I would have to emphasize as one of the key obstacles the lack of political will that we see throughout the OSCE region when it comes to working on Roma issues as a whole, including issues of education and segregation. We see a very strong Roma sentiment that, according to European Union's own statistical data, stays the same, meaning equally high, and where we see politicians who are increasingly reluctant to address Roma issues that are because they perceive it as dangerous for their own agenda and especially especially in pre-election periods. On the contrary, we see an increasing number of politicians that are using anti-Roma sentiments for their own agendas. And in that kind of atmosphere, raising issues that concern the enjoyment of human rights for Roma is something that very many politicians are extremely reluctant to engage in. So on one hand, we have racism that clearly exists in the society. On the other hand, we have politicians who we would consider to have the primary responsibility to speak about these issues, address them, and do something about them, increasingly unwilling to address them and more willing to echo the anti-Roma sentiment from their voters. And I would like to end with an illustration. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was reading an article about Kenneth Frazier, who is an African-American, who is a CEO of the Merck pharmaceutical company, and who is one of the very few African-American CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies. And it struck me when I was reading that article, when at one point he mentioned that he was a child in the inner city of Philadelphia, and that he was fortunate to be bused every day to a desegregated school. And he clearly says this was probably not the only factor that contributed to his later success, but he does mention this as something that was very, very important and that opened a path for him that led to other very important opportunities for him. And it is very sad to see that, several decades later, compared to the U.S. context, many Roma children are still waiting for their bus to arrive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. So I think these were both very rich presentations and raised many actually profound questions about how social change happens and how one can use existing mechanisms such as legislation, courts, press, politics, to really move a multifaceted problem from the place where it is to somewhere better. I'd like to start with a few specific questions, if I may, to each of you, and then maybe we can just have a more general conversation here, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Rostas, first of all, you talked about Hungary, Croatia, Dr. Peric mentioned the Czech Republic, of course. Are there any European Union member states which you would say are examples of good practice or better practice? Are there any areas, whether it's a whole country or maybe cities, because you mentioned the importance of local governments, and I think sometimes it is city governments actually which play a key role in these questions. Are there any contexts which you think we might look to as examples that are encouraging and that could be used as precedents for other municipalities or other regions which are not doing so well?
Yes. But when I'm saying yes, I'm not optimistic. So one example is the government of Hungary during 2002 to 2010. What happened in 2002? At that time, were elections, and the new government, which was socialists and liberals, the coalition, came with a reform of the education. They also recruited our Roma activists to lead the department in the Ministry of Education that dealt with school segregation, or rather school desegregation. And what happened was that through a series of legislative changes and new programs, school segregation school desegregation became a governmental policy. So unlike isolated initiatives sponsored mostly by private funds, especially by a Soros network of foundations, this became a state policy. So there were teacher training centers set during the whole country. There were different other reforms, money that were used for minority education and were in fact misused by school principals because they were interested in attracting, for example, Roma children because they received a quota, a 25% in more budget for the minority children, yeah, were used only for integration. So if you are a segregated school and you want to keep that plan, you don't come with a desegregation school, then you are not receiving those funds. And the results were visible in the 2009 PISA test in Hungary. So there is a proof that school desegregation, not only that it works, but it has results for all the children, yeah, for the whole system. So when you have it as a policy, then it affects positively the whole educational system. Otherwise, there are isolated cases, projects, initiatives that are working because, funders are very flexible. I was proudly associated with the Open Society Institute at the time with the Roma Participation Program, and we funded desegregation initiatives in Bulgaria, including busing initiatives. And they are still working nowadays. But the government never took over those initiatives and transformed them in a policy. Some of them failed because we were generous enough when they needed some extra training or something, we were able to provide. But that's not how government and the policy works. So there are positive examples. Unfortunately, immediately after 2010, when a change in government took place, the reforms taken by the new government led to rather an increase of Roma school segregation. Basically, there are actors that are claiming in Hungary that nowadays Roma school segregation is more widespread than it was in 2002, which is extremely disturbing.
Thank you so much, and actually interesting analogy with African American situation where also people argue that now, despite busing and despite Brown versus Board and so on, school segregation in the US is actually more dramatic than it used to be, and that you're going to find less integration between different community schools and less integration of minorities into high-performing schools. So this is a very important point of concern. Dr. Parish, I wanted to ask you to pick up on the point that you made about improvement in access, but lack of improvement in performance. This is, of course, a common problem in education, not only with Roma students in Europe, but globally, that we've seen, particularly in the primary school arena, a massive increase in school enrollment, A, B, to some extent also attendance, because of course you can enroll and then not attend, but enrollment and attendance. But the consequent improvement in performance and in actual learning is much slower. And so I think from what I gather from the international arena, the real challenge, of course, as you rightly say, is monitoring, it's training, but I think it's also something to do with motivating and including teachers in the project of education. My sense, and this is speaking from work in Asia rather than work in Europe, is that very often teachers are seen as the culprits. They are blamed for poor standards, they're blamed even, this may be less true in Europe, for absenteeism and so on. But the notion that actually teachers are given respect and given a voice in developing curriculum, developing a school environment which could be productive, that I think is much less developed. So I wanted to ask you, as you think, institutionally from the hold your perspective about improving not just access but quality of education. What are the measures that you're thinking of, and what are the mechanisms that are being introduced to move beyond just the head count of who's actually sitting on a chair in a school to who's really learning ideally to read and to count, but also to think critically and eventually to break the glass ceiling of educational achievement? So just would like some of your thoughts on that point, please.
Thank you for your question. Well, first of all, I would like to mention the issue of a need for an integrated approach in resolving issues affecting Roma communities throughout Europe, because we cannot treat these issues in isolation from one another. And let me give you an illustration of what I practically mean by that. So, issue of school segregation, and particularly Roma children who do not have any intellectual or physical disability being placed in these so-called special schools for children with this kind of disabilities. And I met parents who told me that they would actually prefer for their children to stay in these so-called special schools. And the reasons that I have been given are the following. These are mostly impoverished families. And they say, in these special schools, children get books for free, they get school lunch for free. And for the parents who cannot afford to give this to the children themselves, this is an important fact. So poverty plays an important role in some of these aspects. On the other hand, I've also had parents telling me that because these special schools tend to, in a large number of cases, be majority Roma schools, they feel, their children feel safer in this kind of school. So that means also that one of the issues to address is the discrimination and security of Roma children in schools where there are also non-Roma children. And these are well-grounded fears, unfortunately. So if we really want to resolve education issues, we cannot do it by only working on education issues. We have to work on a number of other factors, social cohesion factors, economic factors, such as employment, such as rightful social assistance, issues such as discrimination, violence against children in schools, discrimination of Roma children in schools by both their peers and their teachers. So we cannot work on education alone because it's a complex issue and requires a response that's multifaceted. So that's one thing. On the other thing, when it comes to reform of education itself, I have seen a bit of a change over these couple of decades that I have been working on this issue, because at first we were advocating for the change of the fact that Roma children who have no disabilities are going to schools where there are children with disabilities. And I've seen a move from that argument to the argument of overall social inclusion in schools, of inclusive education. So it's no more about Roma children should not be in these kinds of schools. It's about no children should be segregated in any kind of special school. All children should and can have an inclusive education. So this is very important as well. And I've seen a number of governments working on inclusive education, including inclusive education of Roma children. And as Julius said, we do see a progress in a number of places. Unfortunately, it's localized. In the vast majority of cases, it's externally financially supported by big foundations such as the Open Society Foundations, or intergovernmental organizations like various UN agencies or the World Bank. And what we also unfortunately see is the fact that these education reforms have very frequently been stalled simply because of the changes in politics, changes in governments, and then a new government comes and says, this is no longer a priority for us, we have other issues that we want to focus on, etc. And the teachers themselves, as you mentioned, are very, very important. But I suppose just like here, teachers are now one of the least paid professions. They do not get good training, they are not paid well, they do not have sufficient resources to work with. Now, of course, this does not excuse a person from doing a good job free of discrimination, but it still affects those who do want to make a change. So this is a very, very complex situation, and what I'm trying to say, this is not impossible to work on, but when we work on these issues, there's quite a few aspects that have to be taken into account and that have to be worked on in parallel.
Thank you very much. Yes, I completely agree with you. There's no one technical solution, and as you rightly point out, questions of performance are also related to questions of inclusion in the whole society, which also affects employment and income and housing and so on. Maybe just one more question to each of you, if I might, and then we'll open it up. So, Iulius, I wanted to ask you, you talked about socialization and the difficulties that arise when Roma kids are separated and, you know, deprived of that opportunity. But of course, it seems to me that equally important is the fact that the non-Roma kids are deprived of that opportunity, and that the ordinary process of breaking down prejudice, which you get from your parents, you get from your society, usually is accelerated by having friends in school and, you know, having the Roma kid sitting next to you who's actually your buddy. So it seems to me that as important as the impact on the Roma minority is the dramatic impact that this has on the majority community, if you like, growing up. So I wonder, and this of course is true of other minorities too, it's also true with disabled populations. If you hive off children with disabilities, you stigmatize them, and then children who don't have disabilities don't have a kind of comfort in, or a kind of ease in addressing, just dealing with them. So I wonder here again if you're aware of initiatives. I know that Magda and I, for example, participated in a project where we were really building a collaboration between Roma and non-Roma adolescents to work together and to address problems together as a team of adolescents, you know, irrespective of which side of the Roma non-Roma divide they belong to. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. And related to that, it seems to me, one of the things that we know now a lot about, including from colleagues here at Harvard and their research, is that educational success and indeed social integration and social flourishing depend a lot on very early childhood development, not just primary school. And particularly for underprivileged communities, ECD is critical as a way of stimulating intellectual progress and language acquisition, supporting parents and so on. So in this context too, talking about two-way socialization, I wonder if you could say whether there are initiatives to integrate Roma children and Roma parents, including single parents maybe, but there aren't that many single parents maybe in the Roma community, but Roma parents into a kind of more supportive family socialization early on. So you're talking about nursery schools, you're talking about preschool situations where communities really come together and relationships are formed before school.
Let me make a point about the teachers. In my work in the field in mostly Central and Eastern Europe, I and my colleagues were very critical of the teachers because of their importance in the education process. Well, then we realized that we have to have them on our side. If there is any change to takes place to desegregate the schools, we need teachers on our side. And then we started a dialogue to see what are the problems. And we realized that through their training, they don't know how to work in a classroom and to deal with diverse needs of the children. Also the size of the class, but also having that kind of training. Because in continental Europe, the German pedagogical tradition centered on teacher is the dominant pedagogical tradition in universities and pedagogical schools. So they don't know how to deal with a class, yeah, that have different needs. In addition to payment and so on. So that's the kind of reform that has to happen, and that will be beneficial not only for the Roma children, but for the whole society. I do agree with you that, in fact, what we have to learn from the Brown versus Board of Education, although usually scholars insist on the need to desegregate, it's also the impact on the whole society, and there are really few that are insisting on that part. There was, especially in the second Brown, a study carried on the impact of the larger society of school segregation, and here we are talking also in Europe about the impact on non-Roma when we talk about segregation. My dream is to see a strategic case in a court initiated by a non-Roma exactly for depriving of the right to a multicultural environment. But there is a lot to go there. Well, on the initiatives, let me make clear a point that is important in Europe. The right to education belongs to the child now. So, of course, as a parent, you might have a say in the education of your children, but there are limits to that. And the European Court of Human Rights, in the famous DH case, made a very clear point about the informed consent, that as a parent, you cannot give away the right to no discrimination. And I think that's really important. So you do have a saying on the education of your kid, but you should not deprive your kid of quality education. Now, that's extremely important in that respect. When we are talking about the right to education, it's a very formal right, but we have to talk also about the content of it. Yeah? And here comes the difficulty, because that's whatever, it's a matter of policy, and courts do not want to get on the content of policies. For that reason, the issue becomes a little bit complicated, and most of these cases are bringing additional clarifications on the content of education. Yeah, in Europe, education is a right that belongs to the kid, and it's the duty of the state to provide that right to education. In EU especially, all these countries have set up through their educational laws, yeah, a minimum level of education that one should achieve, and that ranges from 10 grades to 12. Yeah. Now that's excellent. What means is that it's the duty of the state to make sure that every kid is in school and is part of the educational system. But that usually do not apply to early childhood education, yeah, because in most of these countries, kindergarten and even pre-kindergarten is not for free, yeah? And then that diminishes the impact of it. But here we see also the discrimination, yeah, which is by law, because the state fails to implement that provision when it comes to the Roma children. Yeah? So basically Roma children, to put it in that way, in another way, do not enjoy the same protection of the law. Just to give you another example, the European Commission adopted an EU framework for Roma national integration strategies. And one of the objectives of this strategy, when it comes to education, was to have all Roma complete primary education. Really? That's your aim when you have that, in fact, by national law at a much higher standard? Yeah? So if EU and the member states aim just to complete the primary education, that means that they go against the law. Because every child should complete at least 10 grades. Yeah? Of course, at the level of community, and local authorities play an important role in bridging these relations between Roma and non-Roma. Racism against Roma is so deeply embedded in the minds of people that, and institutions that became almost a code of conduct. Yeah. So therefore, it takes a while to go over that. Things that normally will not be acceptable, when it comes to Roma, they are becoming acceptable. So my advice for whoever has doubts about anti-Gypsyism is always to replace, when it comes to a Roma, the word Roma with, you know, Jews or African American, and see if it sounds weird. Yeah? And then you will realize if that's, you know, racism or not. But otherwise, people in their behavior just take it for granted that, you know, for example, Roma, it's not part of their education to go to school. Well, it's not that. In fact, Roma parents are making a huge effort to keep their children in school exactly because they face financial deprivations, and for them, keeping their children in school is a huge effort. So, but when you do all this, you want to make sure that your child is safe in school and that, you know, it's not abused either by their peers or by teachers and so on. It comes also to the identity. When it comes to initiatives on early childhood education, yes, there were a few of them, but we have always to be very aware of the potential racism within these initiatives. We had, for example, in Hungary, initiatives, as I said, until 2010, that were very welcomed by the community, and these were not only for Roma parents, yeah. Of course, mostly were Roma mothers, but not exclusively. But then we had also the reverse, where somehow the nursing had to do, for example, with hygiene and all the racist assumptions that, you know, are related to Roma in that respect. So no, Roma parents do know how to take care of their children. They need support, but the way to provide that, it has to be to take into consideration several other aspects.
Thank you very much. And just briefly, Tatiana, last question. You mentioned OSCE's kind of visionary notion that security also depended on the human dimension, including on human rights. And you talked about the importance of realizing how segregation can be a threat to security, segregation or discrimination. And of course, this is true in many other communities too. And I know we have colleagues here in the audience who are working, for example, on Rohingya. And again, talking about how discrimination, segregation, stigma can actually then fuel issues which could have spin-offs in terms of security. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit about how you see that nexus. I mean, one can think of very reductive ways in which, you know, one associates exclusion with, you know, then attraction to terrorism or whatever. But I just wondered what you had in mind about this nexus between security agenda that is kind of the dominant main agenda in OSCE and this question of discrimination, how you conceive of the link.
Well, thank you for noting yourself that these issues can be controversial sometimes. In the OSCE, every year we have a different participating state as the chairmanship, so-called chairmanship in office. And for the past, I believe, 4 or 5 chairmanships, there has been a focus on youth and security. And what we always try to emphasize from the point of view of Roma youth is that youth should not necessarily be, not necessarily, but definitely should not be seen only as a potential threat in terms of radicalization. And it is very problematic also that this radicalization of youth issues is very often perceived as something that affects minority youth, whether that's Muslim youth, or for instance, in the recent past, we have seen in several of the OSCE participating states the phenomenon of increasing securitization of Roma communities, Muslim Roma communities, and Muslim Roma youth as potential security threats in that respect. And we are constantly changing, our office is constantly trying to change that paradigm and to remind the authorities of the fact that Roma communities have security concerns themselves, and that the participating states have to take this into account. They have to make Roma communities feeling, that they have to ensure that Roma communities are also feeling safe and secure where they live. Whether it's security in the sense of being free from police violence, being free from right-wing violence, etc. Also being free from issues that affect safety of the community itself, whether it's domestic violence or other issues that are very often ignored by the police, because the police focuses primarily on Roma as a threat. You know the trope about Roma as criminals. And they don't care about the security concerns of Roma communities themselves. So this is just one of these aspects that we are trying to focus on, because we think that essentially, as long as people feel discriminated, insecure, as long as there is violence against them, there cannot be any human security in that kind of context.
Okay, well, I think this was a rich discussion. So could I see a show of hands? Could you please just very briefly introduce yourselves as I call on you? And do we have mics or people? Could you? That would be great. Thank you. So let's see. Let's start over here. The lady in the white. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do we just introduce ourselves?
Yes, just briefly. No, please introduce yourself.
So I'm Corina. I come from.
Can you just turn it on, actually, because yeah.
So I come from Romania, and a country which definitely lags behind on this issue. So my question is, should I say the question?
Yes, please do. Go ahead. No,
So,
say the question. We might take 3 questions, so maybe note them down as they come in, so you don't forget them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I come from Romania, and I come from the majority, and I can speak from having grown up in Romania that there's an incredible lack of awareness of these issues. So people just get overly exposed to what appears in the news, to aspects and interaction with the community that actually deepen their prejudice. And I haven't really seen much change coming from local authorities to expose this narrative. To be honest, the one example that I recall in our conversations making a difference is the movie Aferim, who showed the history and actually showed many Romanians that had absolutely no idea that there's a history of slavery of Roma in Romania. My question is, how do you think we can engage entities beyond the local authorities in a way that they can make these facts like visible to the majority, and maybe this way gradually also turn into a a demand-driven driven change. Because here in the U.S., I see the white population demanding acceptance and rights for minorities, whereas this doesn't happen in my country.
Thank you very much. Okay, second question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'm Mukul, I'm a Mason Fellow from India. My question is about the larger framework of acceptance. And it comes from the fact that discrimination becomes a political tool. So it goes across party ideologies in this instant case of the Romas as well. And the larger electorate also has the same kind of discriminative attitude towards the Roma. So what is the way forward? Because you have to engage with stakeholders, and one of the things I see is that international community is calling upon the governments to give a chapter of the Roma history in the best and the positive sense, which doesn't seem. So it's a larger question of acceptance, because legal tools are a framework which are very sovereign to a state and depend on the willingness. So all that we are arguing about rights will be very contingent about how states do. And it's a larger framework of acceptance that I want to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, at the back.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Rachel Martin. I do human rights for women dealing with violence. 3 ideas came to mind here. One is the idea, I had not known the Roma situation was so desperate. In the U.S., back in the 1930s and 40s, there was an idea that to deal with Native Americans to either completely wipe them out or assimilate them. And at that time, they decided to come up with this idea of assimilation, forced assimilation. So very similar. Take children out of communities, bar them from language, speaking the language, keep them in completely isolated situations, similar to this. So that was one thing that came up, and perhaps using that as a, not complete model, but a way of saying this is similar to or needs to be addressed, such as the idea of radicalization. I'm a little concerned about that, because we didn't look at that as a ongoing problem until I think about the last 20 years. Prior to that, or communities that were in deep need were not considered places where there was radicalization happening. And last, about security issues. I think of Rwanda, where the women's rights issues finally became an issue of national security, and such as the way the Roma are being treated is a security issue, because an entire area of all of Europe is being kept apart, kept in, separate. What do we do about any one of these? Can we address any one of these?
Okay, thank you very much. So let's start. Who'd like to start? Tatiana, why don't you start?
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. I'll try to answer them in a brief and limited way, and I'll be happy to talk to you more if necessary. The work of my institution is quite specific, because we are primarily oriented towards the states and supporting the states in implementing their commitments. When it comes to raising awareness and we see ourselves as a platform that Roma civil society can use to raise this kind of issues. And we put a lot of emphasis on making sure that Roma women activists and youth activists are also given the floor to express their concerns. But another way of, small way of doing this is, for instance, we have specialized trainings. We have trainings for police officers who work with Roma and Sinti communities, police officers that work generally on hate crime issues, prosecutors that work on hate crime issues, etc. And we include sessions in the Roma-specific trainings that deal with history. So there are occasions that police officers hear for the first time from us in Romania that there was slavery. We unfortunately also had situations that there was Roma slavery in Romania. We unfortunately also had situations people claiming that this is not true, simply because they have never heard about it. So these are the small ways of how we can work on this, partly because of the specific type of the mandate that we have. And I also wanted to address, when it comes to forced assimilation, this was happening in the case of Roma as well, in the territory of the then Austro-Hungarian Empire during the reign of Maria Theresia, who was implementing policy massively, forcibly taking away Roma children from the territory of primarily today's Hungary, taking them away from the families, banning them from speaking the language. So now you have in Hungary a very specific situation where only around 10% of Roma actually speak Romani because of the history of forced assimilation and being forced to forget the language of your ancestors. And just the last remark, I'm very sensitive to the issue of radicalization, and my favorite question is, why do we, when we talk about radicalization, why don't we immediately think of radicalization of young, for instance, young white people at the right end of the spectrum, because this is the radicalization that I also see growing, and that is very concerning, but I don't see anyone addressing that.
Thank you very much. Julius, do you want to maybe talk about this question of acceptance, which I think hasn't been addressed yet, and how change might happen through that process, or any other comments you want? We don't have a lot of time, so I might take one more round of questions.
Absolutely. So there are some things that can be done. First, it's educate the society, both Roma and non-Roma, about what happened in the past. There is so limited knowledge on these issues. And for example, on Roma, there is no information included in the curricula. So if I would have to point out something, what can be done to address these issues, there are a few points. My upcoming book tries to answer why policies towards Roma in Europe are failing. So it's a more complex issue. But in the whole issue of acceptance, I think it's important to collect data and to make them available. For example, in the last years, governments refuse to make data available because they know that segregation is unacceptable. So they say, we don't collect data, though they have them. Amend anti-discrimination legislation, train teachers, adapt curricula to include information on Roma, including the fact that they were victims of Holocaust, of forced assimilation during communism. To set up a credible mechanism to evaluate and monitor these policies, to support the needy, to tackle racism and discrimination in the society, employ affirmative action, because that's the way to compensate for the centuries of discrimination, and maybe the most important, work and engage with Roma. Assimilation was, a characteristic of the policies towards Roma since their arrival into Europe. There were hunting of gypsies. There were even prizes for those that killed gypsies. They were subjected to assimilation also in Western Europe, in Spain, even under Franco. Roma were forbidden to wear traditional clothes and to speak Romanesque. So today in Spain, you have under 0.1% of Roma that speak Romanesque. There were cultural appropriations. Not only that flamenco, for example, was labeled as a Spanish heritage, cultural heritage, but now, since the Spanish government recognized that this is Roma, now it seems that there is another attempt to label it as an Andalusian, a mixture of African and so on, and that's unacceptable. But when it comes also to Roma, there are a few initiatives also that go beyond the state initiatives, and one of them is the establishment of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. And I do hope that this institution will bring some change. Last week we had the launching, the outreach event in Berlin, and there was a theater played by Roma artists, very radical, and I wish they could, for example, go around and play that and show exactly what was going on. I think art is one means to communicate the situation.
Thank you very much. Okay, we just literally have a couple of minutes, so any more questions? Yeah. Just okay, Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Magda Mataki. I'm a student here at the HKS. I'd like to build on Corina's point on slavery and frame my question around the issue of reparations. And because you mentioned special schools, and I really love your idea because I think, Tatiana, it's important to build bridges between the Roma movement and the children with disability movement, so that we fight for inclusive education for all. And I think it's a loss that we could not do that yet. But my question is that, knowing that the Roma were placed in schools for children with mental disabilities as a result of eugenics politics and policies back in the days, I think my question is, how do we frame repair of harm today by taking into account this legacy which comes from the past, and we need not only to look at the present day, but also how we repair the harm for generations. So is there a case for reparations in this situation?
Oh, okay. Yeah, one more question.
Thank you. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School and also at MIT. And my question is, if there is any lessons that we can take from all the Roma issues that we can apply to provide better education to all the refugees that are coming now to Europe, that also speak different languages. The cultural differences are also huge, and even in terms of religion is also quite different from the ones that we are used to.
So why don't we, maybe one of you answer one question and one the other. One question is about reparations, one is about lessons learned from Roma situation for other, minorities like refugees and primarily including Roma. Thank you. So, Tatiana, if you don't mind starting.
Thank you for these additional questions as well. Thanks, Magda, for raising this issue. Please let me take off my OSCE hat for a second while answering your question. I think definitely yes. I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation these 18 young people from the Czech Republic who launched the case that the legal procedures that brought us to DH versus the Czech Republic. And by the time that the European Court of Human Rights reached their decision, it was already too late for them because they were already adults with children of their own who were probably to enter into the segregated educational system as well. And the least we can do, and the least they could do, was to engage in these legal procedures in order to make the problem seen, and with the hope that this would not happen again. So I would think definitely there is a case, and we all should, as a minimum, try to stop this practice so that it doesn't affect future generations, as a minimum.
Thank you.
Well, on the lessons learned, there are plenty, but let me give you an example. At the Central European University, we have a non-degree program for Roma graduates to assist them, to facilitate their transition to English language MA programs in good universities. And that is going on for 12 years with amazing results. Yeah. Last year, based on the experience of Roma graduate preparation program, CU started a program for refugees on the same model. So we are providing a non-degree program for refugees, not only in Hungary but also from other countries that are able to come and to receive that kind of training and to assist their education. I think that's absolutely fabulous, and I'm glad that we can deal with this in such an innovative way. On the other hand, I want to emphasize something, that problems faced by Roma in Europe cover all major human rights issues in the world, from combating terrorism to migration, police violence, right to life, and so on. So there are plenty of opportunities if you engage in deeper research in some areas to be able to extend them, and to learn from the experience of other oppressed groups as well. So in that sense, it's the kind of area to study that will bring you not only satisfactions, but that kind of intellectual challenges that we all enjoy, and that's the reason we are all here. Just a last announcement, I brought with me 3 copies of the book I edited, so those of you that would like to get a copy, please approach me. You'll get it for free.
Thank you very much. I think this was a really rich discussion which touched on quite complex issues of social transformation and integration, segregation, inclusion, the role of different entities, both non-governmental organizations as well as municipal, state and international organizations. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our 2 excellent panelists.